Hi and welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today we're painting Edmark Valoran, the Manticore Knight from the Darkwater box set from the new Warhammer Quest series. So once again I've coated the model in Vallejo black primer and then gone over the whole model using AK Tenebrous Grey. That is an optional step. I do it just to add a different sort of colour to the shadows, and I find it quite useful for when we do metallics because it offers a nice dark dusty sort of feel instead of just a standard black. I'm going to start by doing a little dry brushing, and for this I'm using one of the Artify Drybrushes, and I'm using AK gunmetal, which is a little bit like Iron Warriors, or you could use lead boucher, any of your silver paints, just your dark silver. And what we're going to do is we're pretty much going to dry brush all of the metallic areas, including pretty much the gold as well, because it'll offer a good base coat for the golds as well. So the point of dry brushing obviously is that you catch all of the raised areas and some of those flat areas as well, leaving some of that deep recess colour as it is, so it provides an instant sort of bright to dark gradient effects. So just work around the model, trying to keep the dry brushing in one direction so that you don't grab any paints, any area that you don't actually want to have any paint on it. Don't worry about hitting the cloak or anything else. Just even if you were to dry brush the entire model, you can always go back over it with the base colours again. Okay, the next colour I'm using is Natural Steel, which is sort of your Stormhole Silver type colour. So this is your bright silver. I'm applying a little bit to a little bit of tissue, and then just to add a little bit of this onto the model, not too much, just catch those bigger raised areas. Anything that you want to be brighter, just catch those. So it's the top of his helmet, the top part of his chest armour and his hands. Not too much. I'm going for a slightly grim dark look on these models. And yeah, I wanted quite a dark looking knight, not too bright. Once you've done the dry brushing, I then just move across to the wet palette, put some of that brighter steel colour, so the natural steel, onto the wet palette, and now I'm just going to add this to some of those edges that I want a bit more defined. So yeah, just the parts around under his eyes, his fingers, anything you want to be a bit more standout. Just add a couple of edge highlights onto those, like the top of his helmet, anywhere that would catch the light quite heavily. Just add some highlights onto that just to really pick them out. And with that, the silver work is done, nice and quick. We're going to move on to doing the gold. So I'm starting with a base coat of AK Rusty Gold. So this is a dark gold colour, and all I'm really doing here is just colouring in, just applying this to anything that you want to be gold. So I went for the lion and trim that's on the shield, the parts on his helmet, the feathers, and the Maticore head. I did the sort of on his sort of skirt of his cloak. There's some gold there, a bit on his sword, and a bit on the hilt. There's little bits around the box art on the in the book. Is really good to show you where the gold needs to be painted. So just apply this all over your gold areas. Okay, once it's dry, then just give it a wash all over of Reikland Fleshshade. You can, if you want, just paint it all over all of your gold areas, but I was trying to be a bit more selective, so picking out the rivet holes, not the whole thing, so just putting it around the rivets and applying any shade to any areas that I wanted dark. I wasn't just going to wash this all over it. You can do so, that's fine. I was just being a little bit more selective in where I was applying some of this shade so that it left some of that rusty gold in the raised areas. So give that a good 10-15 minutes to dry. In the meantime, I actually went over and repainted all of the areas in Tenebrous Grey again that had been caught with the silver that I didn't want to be painted, so I didn't waste any of that time. And then on the wet palette I've got some AK Old Gold, which is sort of a Retributor armour from the Citadel range. And all I'm doing here is edge highlighting and adding a little bit of picking out any of the sort of rivet holes. This is really just picking out any of your highlights. Simple edge highlights, a few little scratch highlights, pick out those little rivets that you've just shaded, and pick out some areas on his feathers and the Maticore head. Pick out any of those raised areas, leaving anything in the shadows that would pick up a shadow, but just making sure you pick out any areas that you want to be bright gold with your bright gold colour. the final step I do is I make a little 50-50 mix of the bright silver and the gold, sort of making a very bright washed out gold, and just do a simple edge highlight and a few dots of this on the areas that would really catch the light quite heavily, just to add some sort of very big shine points. With that, we're less than sort of, I guess, 20-25 minutes in, and we've painted all of the armour up to quite a high standard. So the next big thing we're going to be painting for Edmark is his cloak. So for this I'm using a base coat of AK Burnt Red, lovely deep brownish red colour. Very simple, just very carefully making sure you don't catch any of that trim. I do a little bit, catch a little bit of the armour, but I just go back and fix it. It doesn't take much to fix the armour. Paint all of your red areas, so I did the cloak and the bottom part of his sort of skirt area. Picked all those out in this burnt red colour. Probably 2 coats is needed here. This is quite thin, this is thinned down a little bit, so yeah, 2 coats of your sort of very dark red. So yeah, this is AK Burnt Red. to really get a nice bright red, we're going to be base coating our highlight areas with white first. So I've added a little bit of AK Intense White onto the wet palette, a little drop of water just to thin it down. And all I'm going to do here is I'm going to pick out anything that I want to be bright red in the pure white. So what this will do, it will, when we paint over it with the red, it will make the red really intense, but then we will have to do a little bit of mixing of paint to sort of blend our very bright red with our very dark red. But all I'm doing here is imagine the white is red and just picking out all of those raised areas and areas that you want to be bright with your white. And even so, if you've got any larger areas, you can go back over like half of that area again with another layer of white to make it even brighter. Right, once the red is dry, I'm then using some AK Deep Red, which Evil Sun Scarlet would be a good colour for this. So, I'm basically, in a nutshell, painting over all of the white we've just painted, but I'm also painting a tiny little bit back into that black red, that burnt red that we originally painted. So if you imagine, so the white that you've painted, just paint an extra little millimetre over, so you're painting the white and the burnt red. So you're starting to create a natural sort of transition from very bright red to back into that dark red. It will help with the next transition that we're going to do with a little bit of mixing. So as you can see here, I'm just painting all over the white and just going ever so slightly over it, so colouring in over your lines back into that darker red, and also make sure that you do any edge highlighting with this colour as well. You should only need one coat, but if you need two, then obviously apply the second coat. Okay, now the fun bit. This is where we do a little bit of mixing. So it's pretty much a 50-50 mix of the burnt red and the bright red, deep red colour. So make a mix. So you've got a nice in-between tone now. So you go from black to the medium, so black red to medium to light red. Now this 50-50 mix acts with a little bit of water into it, one drop of water, acts as your mixer now between your very dark colour and your very bright colour. And it offers up a nice transition. You could do all this by wet blending, but I often find it gets a bit messy, especially on these smaller models. So the idea here is to paint the area of that sort of where we painted over it with our light area. What I'm doing now is I'm painting half of the brush width on the black, the darker red, and half of it on the lighter red. So you're sort of doing a 50-50 of your brush stroke from the light red to the dark red, and then you'll start to see a natural transition between the two colours. It's a bit tricky to do on some of those smaller areas, but the idea here is I'm painting half of it over the light area and then half of it within that dark area, leaving a little bit of the very dark red as it was. And if you find the transition isn't to your liking, you can add a little bit more of your mid-tone colour that we've got here. You can make a little glaze of it and glaze a little bit of into there. You could add a little bit more of the darker red into the mix so you get another transition colour. But I find these two colours with this third mix as a transition, it makes it quite easy. Just a little bit of, possibly a little bit of glazing to do with this tone to add a little bit of water into it. And just make your brush strokes really small, really precise. Try and blend the paint, little scratches here and there, little dots, to make the two colours blend in together. And the final step is we're just going to do a final little bit of edge highlighting, pick out some of the more intense raised areas. And for that I'm using the amazingly named Violent Vermillion from the War Painters Fanatics range. Cadian Flesh tone will be just as good for this. It's just a sort of salmony pink fleshy type colour, and all I'm doing here is I'm gently and carefully edge highlighting the robes and picking out any of the raised areas on any of the sort of leg areas, or anywhere really where there's a raised area and you want it to look a little bit like it's catching the light or a little bit more worn. Very careful with this. It's quite a jump from your reds into this colour. I say you could use Cadian Flesh tone as well, it's equally as good as this colour. Annoyingly, the camera broke as I was recording, so I just happened to miss out the showing you how to do the leather. But it's done with 3 colours, which is AK Leather Brown, AK Saddle Brown, and a little bit of AK Vamperic Flesh. So base it all with the leather brown, then do some highlighting with the saddle brown, and a final edge highlight with the Vamperic Flesh. So to paint the sort of tassels, or sort of almost what I think are scrolls coming from his helmet, as well as the underside of his cloak. First of all, I base coat all of these in AK Mud Brown, which is your sort of Steel Legion drab if you're looking at the Citadel range. Once that's base coated with that colour, I then do a 50-50 mix between the Mud Brown and the AK Light Earth, which is more or less like your Xandri Dust type colour. Make a 50-50 mix and then paint in, covering half of the area, the raised areas, the bits you want to be brighter, and then transition that into a full mix of the light earth as your final edge highlight and spot highlight for the underside of the robes and the scroll work. So these are your sort of mid-tone brownish ivory colours. I find Mud Brown and Light Earth work really well together and mix really well and create lots of different tones. But for the Citadel range, it is still Legion Drab, Xandri Dust, Ushabti Bones are the colours you would sort of look for to do that. This next stage is optional, but I grabbed a very, very small brush, got some Kislev flesh, and I just very carefully picked out inside of his helmet, just picked out his eyes very, very carefully, very, very thin, small brush. This part is optional, but you're almost dry brushing the paint in there, as it's really, really hard to pick out the detail. One of the final pieces of the puzzle is his sort of axe. So obviously we want to paint that nice and glowing. So to get the glowing effect, we have to add the white, which the fluorescent paints work off of. So I just decided to, where the intense glow would be the sort of central point of this axe, and obviously the little flames coming off the back of it. So anywhere where you want to be extremely bright, just use your pure white paint as the sort of central glowing point, and then we're going to use the airbrush to transition away from it. If you don't have an airbrush, you could do this with glazes, so start off with your thick line of white and then glaze some white into those areas, but glazing white can be tricky sometimes because it can leave a sort of chalky finish to the surrounding areas. So usually when you glaze in white, you have to glaze in a darker colour the opposite direction so that you get some natural transitions. That's dry. We're going to move over to the airbrush using some Vallejo white ink, just carefully making sure you're pointing, sort of using it away from the model. I just point the nozzle into the central points of those major glowing areas and use the airbrush's natural haloing gradients, just a couple of sprays, and you'll get a nice gradient from that intense white core out to the darker areas, and then just work yourself around the axe, getting those gradients. The aim here is that we're getting a gradient from the core to the end of the axe. If it was all white, then it would be a little bit too, to have bright areas you need dark areas. So that's what we're creating here, brightness gradienting into darkness. So for our premise here, bright is hot, dark is cold. Then we move over and use some Green Stuff World Fluorescent Orange Yellow. it's not a pot of fluorescent orange, or is it a pot of yellow? It's a mix. Green Stuff World have mixed the two, fluorescent orange yellow. It's a nice fiery fluorescent colour. And then you just put it in the airbrush, a couple of drops of, maybe one drop of water once you've put some into the airbrush, and then just spray over the entire axe and a little bit of the surrounding areas with this fluorescent colour. Then we're going to add some Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red. Same premise here, but it's a bit annoying here, you can't actually see it. What I'm actually doing here is I'm pointing the nozzle of the airbrush upwards towards the axe, so that the paint catches the cold edge of the axe and then sort of over the lip, so it cools the intenseness down, trying to leave the intensity of the yellow orange in the core of the axe. And then also painting, applying this airbrush with onto those ends of the flames as well. Again, same premise, that the cold is at the edges, the hot point is in the middle. And this fluorescent red really adds some heat to the axe. It makes it look a lot hotter by toning it down. Finally, I add a couple of drops of Tenebrous Grey into the airbrush, a couple of drops of water, give it a good mix, and then use the airbrush and then apply this at the very tips of the flames and the very bottom edge of the axe, so that we get a sort of a gradient from the very light to the very dark. And then to finish off, I'm putting some Tenebrous Grey onto the wet palette, and I'm going to be just picking out now the areas that I want to be really cold. So that's the very edge of the axe, and then adding in some little scratch marks as if the metal has crackled where it's got so cold. I also pick out any raised areas that's on the axe, so they'll be cold as well with this colour, and just paint a little bit onto the very tips of the flames with the Tenebrous Grey. Wanted to increase the intensity of the glow, so with a little bit of the white I paint back in a couple of little dots in the very centre, and then do a couple very carefully of some little lightning cracks. That's a size 0 brush. You could use a smaller brush if you wanted to, but very carefully here. Just add a couple of little almost lightning streaks. And then once that's dry, I grab some AK Fluorescent Yellow and just paint over the white we've just done with the AK Fluorescent Yellow. And once that's done, I applied some transfers onto his cloak. There were some Cities of Sigmar ones that I had as just some skulls. Applied those using the general method, then put some varnish over the top, some matte varnish over the top. A couple of green Stuff World Tufts on the base. I based this one with just using sort of dark browns and medium and light rust colours, watered down washes onto there, and then did the base rim with a matte black on there. So nothing clever with the base. Again, I wanted a very toned down look to these models. I just picked out the skull and any rocks with a sort of mud brown light earth mix, and that's Edmark Valoran all done. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, a relatively short one from me. Next up is Balga the Cyst Witch, probably my most favourite model in this series. So like, comment and subscribe. All your comments and subscriptions are really keep me going. If any questions you've got, just drop me a line and I'll get back to you. And happy painting, my fellow questers.